Welcome to the Fiber Optic Center's Jazz Podcast Series with your host, Dave Reis, one of the area's foremost authorities on the South Coast jazz scene from the post-World War II years to today. The South Coast Artists Index thanks the Fiber Optic Center for their continued support of the arts on the South Coast and underwriting this 10-part jazz podcast series. Your host, Dave Reis, will help preserve the memory and legacy of the jazz artists coming to and from the South Coast and how they helped to shape what jazz is today. And now, Dave Reis.
Hello, I'm Dave Reis, hosting my first podcast here. I was on as a guest and then they got recruited to be a host. And today I'm going to cover jazz musicians of New Bedford. And it's been my passion to introduce people to jazz and introduce them and give them information about the artists. I did radio at WUMD, UMass Dartmouth. I also was WSMU before that. And that was the reason why I do it. My passion was to introduce people to jazz and introduce them to different genres of jazz, because the word jazz covers so much different types of music. And so it's like a commercial. The guy says, what's the best mattress for me? Best dress for me is not the best mattress for you, and that's the same thing with jazz. There's some jazz that I would never play. But anyway, I want to introduce you to 6 men here in New Bedford. On the wall at Neal Weiss's Fiber Optic Center, and Kat Knutson, who did the wonderful job of painting that wall, is on podcast here on South Coast Artists Index. And the first musician I'm going to talk about is Paul Gonsalves. And Paul has one of the most famous solos in jazz, and it was by accident. He was performing with Duke Ellington. He performed with Duke Ellington for 20-something years. He was performing with Duke Ellington, and he took a solo that he did every night they played. It was a short solo, and Domingo Crescendo was the name of the song. And as he was playing the sax, this woman got up and started dancing, and she kept dancing, so he kept playing, and even went into from jazz like a rhythm and blues solo so she could dance to. And so that solo was very famous. It was recorded, and it made like a comeback for Duke Ellington. Things were slow, and after that recording, Duke was back on the road again. In fact, they put his picture on Newsweek magazine right after that. So, and Paul originally was from Pawtucket, Rhode Island. He was born in Brockton. He was from Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And years back, there was a Cape Verdean group of men that taught the fellas how to play music, and then they went on to jazz. But before that, one of the men, they'd have a Sunday contest, and different groups would come and play. And Paul came with his 2 brothers. His father taught them how to play guitar, Cape Verdean music, and they came and they would win it all the time. And then Joe Livamento, who's my uncle, had a band that played Don Verdi. They played jazz, and their guitar player had to leave, so he had asked Paul to come down. Could Paul come and play guitar? So Paul says, yeah. So he came and he lived with my grandmother while he was here. And then one day they asked Paul asked them, I should say, could I bring my sax? I have a sax. So when he came and brought his sax, he never played guitar for them anymore. He became their sax player. So he stayed here in New Bedford, and I played with the Duke Oliver Band and the Phil Edmund Band. They were the first 2 big bands here in New Bedford, the jazz bands. And there were a lot of Cape Verdean musicians. They went into, the young guys wanted to play jazz. And so Paul stayed here and then went into the Army. When he came back, he was playing in Boston with Sabi Lewis, and he got called by Count Basie to come to New York. He was with Count Basie a short time. And then after Count Basie, he went on with Dizzy Gillespie, which was one of the best bands ever, the All-Stars. The guys that were in the band in the sax section with Paul was Gene Ammons and tenor, and the alto player was Jimmy Heath, and the other alto player was a young kid named John Coltrane. But unfortunately, there was a strike by the musicians union, so they couldn't record. So that band never got recorded. Milt Jackson was in the band, Ray Brown, All-Star Band. Unfortunately, they weren't recorded. And then from there on, he went to Duke Ellington and played with Duke Ellington until he passed away. Well, Duke was sick when he passed away, so they weren't playing. All right, and next person we're going to talk about, and I'm going to introduce you to, is Joe Livramento. Joe played alto, tenor, flute, and clarinet, but basically he played alto mostly. He started on clarinet in the Don Verdi Band as a teenager, then joined the Phil Edmond Orchestra. Phil Edmond and Duke Oliver, the first two big bands out of New Bedford, jazz big bands, and they played music with Duke Ellington and Count Basie. And then the Phil Edmond Band played in New Bedford, Boston, and colleges. And Joe and Phil and Paul Gonsalves were best friends. They moved to Boston, and then they all moved to New York. And Joe and Phil were called to play with the Roy Eldridge Orchestra. Roy was one of the best trumpet players after Dizzy Gillespie at the time. And then Joe went on to play with Jimmy Lunsford Orchestra, Lucky Millender. He later joined Machito's Afro-Cuban Orchestra, and they played at the Palladium in New York City every night. And they did 2 CDs with guest artists. When they played at Palladium, a lot of the big artists like Dizzy and the guys would come up and want to sit in. So they did 2 CDs with Cannonball Adderley, fine alto player, Joe Newman, trumpet player from Basie's band, Herbie Mann, Johnny Griffin, Curtis Fullers, and you can buy this CD. It's called Kenya. Actually, it was 2 albums, but with CDs, they made it to 1 CD, and it just came out again. You could get that. And now we're going to play. Then Joe finished his career at Roseland Ballroom in New York, and he didn't have to go on the road anymore when he got older. And then he retired and played here in Rhode Island until he passed away. Okay, the next artist I want to introduce you to, actually there's 2 of them on the wall. These artists that I'm talking about, as I'm not sure I mentioned before, I'm introducing you to the artists on the wall downtown at Center Street. Beautiful job done by Kat Knudsen. So the 2 next musicians are on the same cut. So we'll hear Bobby Green and Herbie King. Bobby's on alto saxophone, and Herbie was a fine drummer, one of the most unique drummers I've seen. And Bobby was born in Macon, Georgia, raised in Savannah. He taught music at UMass Dartmouth and hosted a jazz and gospel program at the university's radio station with WSMU-FM. He played alto and soprano sax with his band Coleus. He founded the band here in New Bedford. He was a composer and a recording artist. His City Suite was premiered at Jordan Hall in Boston. City Suite was a fine production we had with musicians from Boston. And Herbie King is his drummer. Bobby Green and Herbie King actually went from New Bedford. They came here to perform with a band, and the band broke up here, and they ended up staying here in New Bedford, and with a 3rd player, Alex Jenkins, who played organ. Herbie was from Savannah, Georgia, and he and Bobby Green grew up playing together. And Herbie was a fine drummer. He, like I said, they were stranded here in New Bedford, and Herbie made connections in Boston. He was teaching in the school system there, and he was used by quite a few bands in the Boston area. And he just was a unique drummer, and he was a good teacher for young kids. He gave lessons here in New Bedford. and we're going to play something from their group Coleus. Armstead Christian is our next artist I want to introduce you to. I'm sure you know who he is if you've been here in the New Bedford area. He was from Poughkeepsie, New York, and then moved over to Boston, and then used to come from Boston to perform here in New Bedford. And he played alto saxophone, flute, sang. He was an actor. He was in a play in Boston. He was just multi-talented. And he graduated from Berkeley and then became a teacher there at Berkeley. And then he married here in New Bedford and became a New Bedford resident. And we were just so fortunate to have him. And we're going to play something by Herbie. And this was at the New Bedford High School.
Looking in my mirror took me by surprise. I can't help but see you running often through my mind, helpless like a baby, sensual disguise. I can't help but love you, baby. It gets better every time. I can't help it if I wanted to. I can't help it, baby, if I could. I can't help it if I wanted to. Couldn't help it, no. Can't help it if I wanted to. Wouldn't help it, baby, if I could. I can't help it if I wanted to. Couldn't help it, no. Like a trip to heaven, put it in your eye. Love came and possessed you, leaving sparkles in your eye. Like a trip to heaven. Heaven is the prize. I'm so glad I found you.
Okay. And the next artist I'll introduce you to, Rick Brito. Rick was from New Bedford. He played tenor, soprano, clarinet, synthesizers. He was a professional web designer. He owned a record studio called Saurus. He was a jazz educator, graduated from Berkeley, and then became a faculty member at UMass and Wheaton College. Assisted the New Bedford High School Jazz Band and the old Rochester Regional High School Jazz Band. And after Berkeley, he went out to the West Coast, and he performed out there, and he was double billed with Ray Brown, Monty Alexander, Rosemary Clooney, Dick Johnson, Dave McKenna, Artie Shaw. These are all artists he were on the same shows with. and he performed with the rhythm and blues with Drifters, Tune Weavers, and Tavars. And the jazz musicians just to keep working, did a lot of rhythm and blues, and a lot of rhythm blues musicians played jazz. And so we're going to listen to Rick Brito from one of his CDs. Okay, so those are the 6 men on the wall. Like I say, if you haven't seen that, you have to go down and see it. Cat did a wonderful job. It's unbelievable. And colors and everything. And it's on Center Street, downtown in the historic district, on the Fiber Optics building wall. So those 6 men, 3 came from New Bedford and 3 came to New Bedford. And now do a little talking about jazz in New Bedford. New Bedford was really known for jazz because we had so many jam sessions. In the old days when they played, guys would find a bar or a club and the owner would hire maybe the piano player, bass player, and then musicians. There was no school of music in Berkeley. They learned on the job, you know, and they would get together. So a guy would have a gig in, say, John's Tavern, and then all the other musicians would come. You never know who'd be walking in the door, would come in, and they would sit in. And then one sax player would be doing something on his sax, and the other one would say, how'd you do that? And that's how they learn. And then they had big bands. Most of the concerts were big bands in those days. And then when it wasn't too expensive for a big band, that's when the guys broke up in little groups doing these jam sessions. And one of the first bands was the Duke Oliver band, and Duke Oliver was sort of like Cab Calloway. Cab Calloway would just be in front of the band dancing. He didn't play an instrument, but the first jazz musicians from New Bedford were played in that band, and then Phil Edmond had a band. They were the first 2, and I think there was another one, John Senna, I'm not sure, had a band, but those 2 bands played quite a bit. In fact, Duke Oliver band went on up until maybe 10 years ago, because when he left, they became the Skyliners, and the Skyliners was the big band here in New Bedford. Frank Montero was the leader of the band after. Actually, Pete Montero took it over. He was the trombone player, and then when Pete got sick, Frank, his brother, the bass player, took over, and the Skyliners just performed up until maybe 10 years ago. It might have even been sooner. And but they got together and they started playing with the Cape Verdean Ultramarine Band, the marching band. The mulemen taught them how to play instruments, and then they decided to stop playing jazz. And the first Duke Oliver band now, for the big bands, you got to have written sections. The trombone players have one section, the trumpet players. So you got to buy the charts, and the guys not being able to afford it at that time. There was a fellow man, Alvaro Duarte, very brilliant man. He was, when he went in the war, he was officer, and he did very well. And then he came out, and so when they performed the band, he played trumpet. He wasn't really a jazz fan as for his music. He's classical music. But he was such a brilliant man. He would play a record of Duke Ellington, listen to it, and write all the charts. He'd write the trumpet section, trombone section, sax sections, and that's how they had music, because they couldn't afford to buy the music. It's amazing, a lot of amazing stories of how jazz started. And so these jam sessions, you go to a club and say, Mike Silver was on piano at the thing. You'd go and you didn't know who else you were going to see playing, and guys were walking with their instruments and they got invited. That's why they call them jam sessions. And it was funny because you see somebody coming in his horn, oh man, you get all excited because so-and-so's going to play. Then sometimes you see somebody coming in with his horn, you say, oh man, look who's coming. But that's how it was, and that's how they learned jazz here in New Bedford, how they started with jazz. They'd have the West Social up the West End. They'd have jam sessions there on Sunday nights. The band club would have one on Sunday afternoon. And in the Piccadilly downtown, who integrated the audiences, because all this was mostly in the neighborhood of color, as all the musicians were. And Piccadilly being downtown, the man started bringing jazz there, so our audiences were the Cape, so, and really promoted jazz throughout the city because of the Piccadilly. And then he would bring in bands from New York or whatever, and they'd be there for a week from Monday until Sunday night. But on Sunday afternoon, they would have jam sessions. And then they would bring in a lot of students from Berkeley who became stars, a lot of stars in jazz or other venues of music played at the Piccadilly when the students. So it was very active here. You didn't know where to go on a Saturday or Sunday because 3 or 4 clubs would be having music, Bobby Green and Coleus would be, Bobby put a lot of things out. And so there was jazz 7 nights a week, because the Piccadilly the act came in where they were there for the whole week. And then on weekends, the clubs would perform. And so New Bedford was well known in New York by the jazz musicians because they came to the Piccadilly and they enjoyed playing here and they loved it here. They would always talk. I'd go up to New York and stay with Paul and my Uncle Joe. And as soon as I said I was from New Bedford, the musician said, where were you from? I said, oh, man, I got another gig there, or I got to get a gig there. I heard about it. Because the Cape Verdean community, it's always been like after an event, it's not over. Somebody invites musicians to the house, they feed them. And then there was a group of guys, they called themselves the Gaylords, and they had a little club. And a big name group would be playing in town. They would talk to them, invite them, and then late at night, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, we'd be listening to those guys jamming, big names in here. So New Bedford was well known for jazz. We had a lot of artists that left New Bedford and did well, and we have a lot of the artists that could have gone, just didn't want to be on the road, they didn't want to be full-time musicians, but we had some competent musicians that could have played with anybody. And we had Jimmy Lomba. Jimmy Lomba's brother, Ray Lomba, played piano. Jimmy played saxophone. And Ray Lomba's the one that got the guys to play jazz. They were in the Ultramarine marching band. He said, let's go start playing jazz. Jazz came out, and he got him. He was a fine piano player. And Jimmy went on to California, and he played with Dinah Washington, quite a few big name bands. He played in studio bands, and Jimmy did very well. Also, along with a bass player, they went together, Porky Brittle, and they did a lot of work there, and Earl Hines Orchestra. And so we had a lot of musicians that went out, and in fact, Porky Brittle, the bass player, his brother, Bill Brittle, went out to Canada, and he was a star bass player in Canada, and when he retired, he came back to New Bedford, and he played with Bobby Green. And then we had couple of guys playing symphony orchestras too, not just jazz. We had a lot of great musicians here. And at that time, there wasn't much else to do but play instruments. Like I asked my uncle, how come all you guys were such good musicians? He said, well, we didn't have much else to do. You either played ball or you played an instrument. And so they got that. And Bob Milganickley, he was a professor at Bridgewater. And he played with the Boston Pops. He's a fine trumpet player and played with other Philharmonic type orchestras throughout the country. So we had quite a few musicians did well, and we had quite a few here that could have made it, but that wasn't their choice to be a musician. There was one trumpet player, Cab Rosario. He played in Boston and with Joe and Paul. They played with Sabby Lewis and other bands. And Cat Anderson, one of Duke's famous trumpet players, played in Boston at that time. And whenever he came with Duke Ellington Orchestra came to play in New Bedford, they played quite a bit in New Bedford, Duke came. And Cat Anderson would call Cab and have him come in and sit in. He'd get it down and let Cab play with Duke. And that's how, and Cat was a star, and he thought Cab was this great musician, you know. So we did have, there was a bass player, Manny Rose. Every time the Piccadilly, they'd have the jam session, and they'd have a name artist come in, play with the local rhythm section. They all wanted to take Manny back with them. Illinois Jaquette, once they heard him play that night, they wanted to play. So like I say, you didn't have to be from New York to be a great musician. Great musicians went to New York. They weren't born there. They didn't come there. And other guys choose not to. They didn't want to do that for a living. And they played in local events. You know, it was a tough gig. You had to love it because, especially jazz at that time, the venues, because of segregation, they did one-nighters. That's why we got Duke Ellington. How we could get Duke Ellington, a famous band like here, like that, Count Basie, and Rhythm Blues, Fats Domino, they all performed here one-nighters because they were doing one-nighters throughout the city to city, living in buses and traveling through the South, sleeping in the buses because they couldn't find a place to sleep. So a lot of the men who were here with family and had a job, they come home to their family, wasn't going to do that, you know. And a few started and came back, you know. And it was tough being a jazz musician. And they weren't making a lot of money, and they were under worse conditions, you know. They'd be in towns, and they couldn't get served by something, you know. And they, in fact, some of the guys on the road, they slept at people's houses, and even funeral parlors. Sometimes they would arrange a few parlors empty. They would sleep. They couldn't find it. So a lot of guys didn't want to leave New Bedford for that, you know. You have to want to be a musician to go through that. You know?
You've been listening to the South Coast Artist Index Jazz Podcast Series, graciously underwritten by the Fiber Optic Center, helping make the best cable assemblies in the world. Located in New Bedford, Massachusetts, the Fiber Optic Center also sponsored the Jazz Mural in the New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park. For more information, visit them at focenter.com. And now, back to the Fiber Optic Center's Jazz Podcast Series with your host, Dave Reis.
When it started, that was in the early 40s, late 30s, because what happened, I was born in 38. Like I said before, Paul lived with my grandmother, and Joe was my uncle. And they, like I said, with the baby, everybody was work, so I was with them all the time. So that's why I was in the surroundings. And I was about 5-6 years old when this happened. So it was in the late 30s, 40s when this happened. And the big bands were so big that I didn't realize this one time that Jimmy Lama, the saxophone player, I went to California. When he came back, I used to take him out. He was in the 80s, and I would take him out. And one day I took him to a place, and this woman came up to him and said, "Jimmy, I remember you. You used to play at lunchtime at Cornell Dubilier. They even had bands playing lunchtime." I had no idea until this woman told them that, you know. So, yeah. And this continued on until the big bands broke up. They couldn't afford the big bands, and that's when the guys did quartets. The guy would have a quartet, and they would have the jam session. Eddie Stack Quartet was a real good quartet. Eddie was from Newport, but he moved to New Bedford, and he worked all the time here, and he didn't leave, but he had a good day jobs. You know, he was a very smart man, and so there was no need for him to be a full-time musician, but he could have been. Yeah. There was Bob Mogelnickley. And in fact, I played tennis with him. He was a tennis partner of mine. He played with Arthur Fiedler's Boston Pops, and he played with Paul Whiteman, who was a big dance band, one of the most popular Paul Whiteman big band. And then he played with other classical music and thing. And then he became a professor at Bridgewater. And Bob was from the north end of New Bedford. And I'm trying to think. There's another sax player right now. I'm bad with names. In fact, Ron Fortier told me he took lessons from him. I'll think for it after. But anyway, he went to the West Coast and did very well. Yeah. And like I say, Paul Gonsalves did well. Unfortunately, Paul never left the Duke Ellington band because he would have been much more famous. In fact, ironically, Paul got famous for that solo, but he was known in the jazz world as the best jazz ballad player. And but being in the Duke's band, he just took short solos. A band plays, you take a short solo. That long solo was because the woman was dancing. And I don't know if I mentioned before, ironically, Paul was playing, and the woman that was dancing, Paul was from New Bedford. The woman was dancing was from New Bedford. They didn't know each other. She was one of the Zeitz family, Zeiterian Theater. She was a Zeitz woman. And her, what happened with Newport Jazz Festival, George Wein was on the club Storyville in Boston, and he also was a piano player. And the wealthy people in Newport, some that lived there in the summer, asked him to run a jazz festival for them, a private one, and he did. And then he got the idea, we could do this. So he talked to them. He said, why don't we have a Newport Jazz Festival for the public? And they did. And this woman was from one of those family. In fact, her husband owned Anderson Little. So that's another reason why the solo went so long, because when she got up and started dancing, security wasn't going to stop her. So they let her dance, you know. Yeah. So the two of them were from New Bedford. If you go up Route 18 from downtown, just before the end, you see that big white building on the right-hand side. It's a church, I believe. That was Sharpshooters Hall. It was a gym. It was a big basketball court for the kids. And this is where the venues they had to play in. Duke Ellington played in there. When there was a promoter from New Bedford, and there's a Cape Verdean man. They call him Baron Grace. I don't know his first name. Cape Verdeans, everybody has a nickname. You don't have real names. And he was a promoter. And he promoted not only just in New Bedford, all through the East Coast with the venues of jazz and rhythm and blues. And he could rent any hall that he could get, he would bring them in. So Duke Ellington played there at Sharpshooters Hall. Bo Diddley, Fats Domino, because those guys, this was a plan. And these are great venues for some of them, because some of the towns they played in had bad places for them to play in. So, and then they had the Cape Verdean, different Cape Verdean clubs, and they would play mostly Cape Verdean music, but it's one night or two nights, or like a Sunday afternoon, the jazz guys would use that place. There was one place a man had in his cellar of his house, he had a little Cape Verdean club. And so during the Second World War, you had bomb shelters. So they called the club the bomb shelter because it was down cellar. So they'd have some Sunday afternoon jazz there, but most of the time it was Cape Verdean music. They mostly played in the Cape Verdean music halls, Verdean Vets Hall and Verdean Hall down the south end where Route 18 is. Now it's gone. So all these big name stars were playing there. In fact, when Duke Ellington played a few times, and then one year, then they had... on Washington's birthday, February 22nd, the Musicians Union had a big event at the New Bedford Hotel. And they would have a ballroom up top. They'd have a big name band, Duke, Count Basie. And every year was a different Louis Armstrong. For their 50th anniversary, they had Louis Armstrong. And then throughout the building, they'd have local musicians be playing. So there was music all day. So that was a real big event. But other than that, it was mostly dance halls. Whatever halls they could find, you know. And in fact, when Duke came, one time before Duke came, he was over in Europe, and Louis Bellson and Pearl Bailey got married, and that was a mixed marriage, and that was a big thing, two celebrities, and it was a big thing, and on the news and everything. Duke was in Europe, and when the press was waiting for them to get back, their first gig was in New Bedford, and there was a drummer, Teddy Betancourt, that played with Joe Livermore and Paul, and he had a drum set like Louis Bellson. Louis Bellson had two bass drums. He used two bass drums. So Teddy had, and so Joe and they introduced him to Louis, and so they stayed here, and they honeymooned. Their hidden honeymoon was right here in New Bedford, in Teddy Betancourt's house. While the press was waiting for them in New York, they went with the band. New Bedford has a lot of history in jazz, I'll tell you. A lot of stories. I mentioned Louis Armstrong, and Ron had me on for the podcast. He asked me, was there any, you met so many people, but anyway, you really got excited, and I couldn't think of anything. and Louis Armstrong was one. This wasn't an event or anything. The New Bedford Hotel downtown. I went to pick up my aunt coming in from Providence, on a bus. And I'll just come over and say, "Hey, Pops, hey!" It was Louis Armstrong. He was staying at the New Bedford Hotel. He was on his way to the Cape, and he came outside and he was just talking to everybody, shaking hands with everybody. And I got his autograph. So I could have used that for Ron's podcast. Then there were some musicians that played. In fact, there was an organist, Richard Groove Holmes, famous organist, and he was playing here with Cat Anson, the trumpet player at the Piccadilly. And then he got his letter. I came in, he showed me his letter, got the recording contract, and he went to California to record. And then Jimmy Smith, the famous organist, before he was famous, like I said, a lot of musicians played here on the way up. And he came with a Don Gardner trio, and we walked up to the Piccadilly. On a Monday, you always went to see who the new group was. And we see a hearse in front of it there. And what it was, he was a Hammond B3 organist, and he carried his organ in a hearse. That's how he traveled. And then he became the most famous jazz organist after that. Yeah, New Bedford has a lot of... And you see, and that's been my passion, to get it out to people. And that's why on the radio, I did the radio and played a lot of the older musicians. I played the new venues, too. And then I introduced people to jazz is tough because jazz covers so many things, you know. I used to do for South Coast Learning Network, Let's Talk Jazz. It was at Wamsutter Club. They had different things like cooking, photography, different places. And I would demonstrate to people, all this is called jazz. And it's so much different. Like you went from Kenny G to John Coltrane. They were both jazz players, but they sound nothing alike the music. So the word jazz, and that was why I was always careful. When I introduced somebody to jazz, somebody said, "I want to go to some jazz." I was careful who I brought them to. I would bring them to a band that, because their first time listening to jazz, they played danceable type jazz, opposed to a guy that was way out there. Even some jazz that I won't play, you know. So the word jazz covers too many venues, in my opinion. Originally it wasn't, because big bands and regular music, but then they come out with synthesizers, and there was less improvisation. Jazz was improvisation, a lot of it. They didn't need to have musicians, yeah. And then what happened was, when the big bands broke up, they were playing the same tunes, you know, popular tunes. They were playing like Irving Berlin, you know. They were just tunes that you would know, and then they would improvise on them, you know. So the chords were from, say, an Irving Berlin song, or, you know, but there wasn't many original music at that time. They would just improvise on songs that were out there, you know. And then it went on to getting more advanced. Then the musicians were coming out from college now, so they knew how to write and do things. So it wasn't total improvisation anymore. In those days, the guy would just say, "Let's play My Funny Valentine." And then they would play it in the jazz version. They'd improvise on it. It was improvisation to My Funny Valentine, Green Dolphin Street. You mostly heard the same tunes at the jam session, but it was played with improvisation. My favorite New Bedford players, I love the bass. And Manny Rose, he played bass with Joe. Manny Rose was one of my favorite bass. But like I said, every time a musician came to play from New York, they wanted to take him back. Manny Rose, and then Paul. And then, of course, I would have to say Joe Lovemento. He was my uncle and my godfather. But in that group, there was Mike Silver was a great piano player. And but I would say Manny Rose. I just loved watching him play the bass. You know, he went on to play after when Joe and Paul went to New York. He was their bass player. He went on to play with Eddie Stack. But there were a lot of great musicians. And they were, like I said, with the jam sessions, a lot of them came through from other towns. They'd come on a Sunday to get in there. Like Toshiko, the famous jazz piano player from Japan, when she was a student at Berkeley, she was playing at Piccadilly almost every Sunday in the jam session. Then she went on to be famous, yeah. And I see Berkeley feathers with a lot of good instruments, yeah. And Gilda Stone Rooster, I don't know if you've heard them. I'll talk about Gilda. She's a woman. She just passed away. She's about 100. She had a club in Mattapoisett in Marion. And the South Coast Jazz Orchestra, they played there. And she brought in a lot of groups. She and her husband, a lot of bands, musicians, I should say musicians from Boston that were performing during the week. and she'd have them there on a Sunday afternoon. And that's what they did a lot of jam sessions. They'd bring guys in, big name guys, to play a Sunday afternoon and get them back to their Sunday night gig. You know, they'd be there for the week in Boston, so then Sunday they get that. But there were so many musicians. It's hard to say your favorite one. There were so many good musicians, you know. Duke Ellington at the New Bedford Hotel, when they had that, they had a great show, and they did a dedication to Paul because he was in New Bedford, and they gave him a presents and stuff. That was a great event. And Count Basie Orchestra, and Fats Domino, all the rhythm and blues. Now, these were rhythm and blues shows. The same man that produced the jazz thing, he would have, and on those tours, they'd have 2 or 3 artists at that night. And so Bo Diddley would do something, and Fats Domino, and then, yeah, those were good events, and those were danceable events. Those are dances, you know, because jazz people listen to. Well, the big band, they dance, but when the guys were playing quartets, but then the rhythm blues shows were. Yeah, this man Baron Grace, he booked them all through this area, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Providence had a lot of events. In Providence. There was a place called the Arcadia Ballroom where they had a lot of, but those were mostly rhythm and blues shows. You know, hit records, guys, you know, like Fats Domino, people like that. Yeah. Jazz audience was more or less people who went in just hear jazz, you know. And that's why I try to get the information out about the artists. A lot of people didn't really know who these artists were or what they did with their background. And what they went through. Yeah. Duke Ellington, well, he could afford it. One time, he'd go on tour, and we'd have a hard time finding a place to stay down the South. He sort of rented a train, and they trained to town and slept in the train. But he could afford it. He was the Duke and Count Basie. Those guys were him. And then Stan Kenton had a big famous band. Benny Goodman had one of the first integrated records. He had Lionel Hampton on vibes and Charlie Christian on guitar because he had a white band. Yeah. But they did a small group recording. I just glad to be able to get this information out. That's my passion because I know those guys and I know what they went through, and I just want people to know they didn't just have fun playing their horns. You know, they went through things, you know. And they didn't make much money, you know. They weren't paid that well. And that's why guys wouldn't leave New Bedford. Guys that were good enough to play wouldn't leave New Bedford to give up their, especially if you had a family, you couldn't do that, you know. And then guys would end up, drugs was a bad thing too. A lot of musicians ended up drug addicts, you know, because that was a style at that time when bebop, Charlie Parker did drugs, and everybody wanted to be cool, so they went along with it. And he used to tell them not to. And these are the things I get out to, and information about the musicians we had here in New Bedford.
Thanks for listening to the Fiber Optic Center's Jazz Podcast series with your host, Dave Reis. Please go to theartistindex.com for more information about the Fiber Optic Center, Dave Reis, or this 10-part jazz podcast series.